Well, I'll break the silence and just welcome everyone as they come through the door out of the waiting room. We'll just allow more people to get online for another minute or so, and then we'll make a start. Thank you. Okay, well, we'll make a start. It's just a minute after 4. There'll be more people probably joining as we go along. But I want to say welcome everyone to this third series of the global webinar. Hi everyone, there are people who have been following the previous 2 series, and I'm sure we'll have some new friends joining us from time to time in the new one as well. Yeah, I just want to explain a couple of things about the aim of this series and the kind of support that we've got from different groups. And then I'll pass over to Juvaria. Juvaria has been working very hard on organizing this new series as well, and thinking through all the big issues and publicizing and trying to get sort of new panels organized and so on, and also kind of setting up the working papers, etc. So really important roles, uh, and she'll be able to explain a little bit more about that in a moment. But as you may know, the global webinars basically have a very simple aim. It's really just to look at some of the big issues in world politics, world economy, and world power, and so on, but try to get a diverse range of voices on those global questions, to try to sort of, if you like, there are elite knowledge networks which are very well established. Many of them are largely focused, located in the global north. They're very well developed. They've been going for many, many decades, and they basically create boundaries in our minds about what are the possibilities of ways in which we can think about the world and the kind of perspectives that we bring. But what we now know also is that those are limited in various ways too, that there are voices around in other parts of the world which have equally interesting and important things to say and perspectives to bring, and research which they've carried out in their own societies, their regions, and on world politics as a whole, which are very valuable. And that this global conversation is absolutely necessary for us to get a full rounded picture of the way in which the world actually works, and thereby improve our understanding. So the aim is, in our own kind of modest way, in a series of webinars, normally 6 in each series, is to try to talk about some big international questions and try to bring, as practicable, diverse voices from different global locations to illuminate. And we're not bound only by the scholarly communities around the world, but also we invite people from the world of media, serious commentators and so on, but people who are involved in think tanks or may have been involved in diplomacy, anyone who's got a serious interest in any aspect of the things that we're talking about and has a contribution to make, which we believe would be interesting, and that would be interesting in the mix of the different voices that we want to try to give a platform to. So that's the basic simple aim. And and I think one of the things that we found is that there's a big question as to what is global knowledge and how do you do it? And that is still something which I find quite perplexing. And it's something I think through conversation becomes a lot simpler than perhaps through publications and so on, where people can speak from their own methodological, theoretical, ideological, or other backgrounds, but in the same conversation on the same big issue, and bring different voices. And perhaps by hearing them in conjunction with one another, we begin to develop a sort of richer range of ideas about that phenomenon that we may be discussing. Actually, the 6th webinar that we have in this series, we've got 4 speakers, but at least 2 of them are going to be speaking about that very subject of how do we do effective global knowledge through global conversation. So that's going to be a very, very kind of interesting webinar. But before we go to that one, just want to say we're really thankful for the support that we've received from all kinds of people, but particularly certain scholarly networks which have been constant in their support for the webinar series. So I'd like to thank the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences, obviously the Center for International Policy Studies at City University of London, which is my own group and within my own department, but also the University of West London and the work of Bamo Nouri in that regard, uh, Raul Rodriguez from the University of Havana, the Global Partnership Network at Kassel, which Aram is so significant within, and LSE Ideas too, which has given us some support as well. So, and one of the differences in this series compared with the last one is um, very kindly, some of our partners came up with some interesting ideas for panels and themes and for speakers. So that made my life and Juvaria's life a lot easier because it's always better to have 6 brains than 2 and 6 sets of networks and so on who are out there kind of communicating and so on. So I'm really pleased to say that today's webinar was arranged, thankfully, by Aram Ziai, who's going to be one of our speakers. And it's to our speakers and their kind of backgrounds that I'm going to hand over to Juvaria to make an introduction. Thanks, Juvaria.
Hi, thank you, Inderjeet. So as you note, our webinar today is about neo-colonialism and global partnerships. Post-colonial scholars have produced a substantial body of work that shows how even in states that have been formally independent for decades, colonialism persists through indirect and often subtle instruments that exert political, economic, financial, social, military, and technical forms of domination. In today's session, we draw linkages between neocolonialism and the idea of global partnership, which underpins many development strategies today. And this is particularly evident in the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, also known as the SDGs. To discuss this topic, we've assembled a very impressive group of speakers virtually over here. And I'll just introduce them now. We have with us Professor Aram Ziai. He joins us today from the University of Kassel. Professor Ziai's focus lies in the fields of development theory and policy, post-colonial and post-development approaches, and global economic governance. He studied in Aachen and Dublin and attained his PhD in political science in Hamburg and his habilitation in political science in Kassel. He has also held research positions as well as teaching positions at universities in Aachen, Magdeburg, Kassel, Amsterdam, Vienna, Bonn, Ankara, and also Tehran. Our second, or rather, I think the order is not consistent with the way I'm introducing them, but our first speaker today will actually be Professor Praveen Jha, who's joining us today from JNU, New Delhi, India. Professor Jha's major area of research and teaching is the political economy of development. His particular focus is on labor, agriculture, and education. And his other areas of interest include natural resources, public finance, and the history of economic thought, with an emphasis on the Marxian tradition. Prior to joining the Jawaharlal Nehru University in India, he taught at the St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi, and the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration in Missouri. And outside of India, he's been a visiting fellow at various institutions across the world, including universities in Germany, Switzerland, China, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. He has also been engaged as a researcher for UN institutions such as the ILO, UNICEF, UNDP, and the FAO. He's also one of the founding editors of the journal Agrarian South, Journal of Political Economy. And among his many books is the recent publication, Labor Questions in the Global South. And we're also joined today by Professor Henning Melber. Professor Melber was director of the Namibian Economic Policy Research Institute in Windhoek from 1992 to 2000. He's also been the research director of the Nordic Africa Institute between 2000 and 2006. And director of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation between 2006 and 2012, both in Uppsala. He's extraordinary professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria and the Center for Gender and Africa Studies at the University of the Free State in Bloemfontein, and also senior research fellow at the Institute for Commonwealth Studies at the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. And since 2017, he is president of the European Association of Development Research and Training Institutes, EADI. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Juvaria. So just before Praveen starts, members of the audience can please use the Q&A function and put in there any questions that you may have as you go along. And at the end, Juvaria and I will kind of curate them and direct them as required. So thanks very much for that. And Praveen, the floor is yours.
Let me begin with my tremendous appreciation to the organizers for hosting this series, which serves extremely valuable functions. And of course, it's a matter of immense pleasure for me to be part of one of your webinar series. So thank you for that, Inderjeet, Juvaria, and of course, Aram, who sort of coordinated this particular conversation today. Now, as my title suggests, which is Contemporary Neocolonialism, Reflections on Major Markers and Ramifications. Essentially, my input would be in the nature of reflection on some aspects of asymmetrical power relations in the context of the current phase of neocolonialism, and a couple of significant implications of that, which are relevant from my point of view, both for theory and indeed practice. So that is the brief kind of remit which I am trying to explore in this conversation. As all of us know, the historic transition that ushered in political independence in the countries of the South, much of it after the Second World War, with the end of the classical colonial model, which was characterized by direct political control, it generated much promise for the peoples of the South, and it was a widely shared kind of optimism, in spite of several limitations and contradictions of the new so-called sovereign regimes. There was a lot of hope which was generated by it across the South, in, of course, varying degrees, but indeed, there was all-round optimism that we can say, which was quite prominent feature of 1950s and 60s. However, even during that time, we had the naysayers. And it's very interesting to note that one of the best known revolutionary figures, a very, very important statesman from the global South, Kwame Nkrumah, right? He, in 1965, most famously denounced the prevailing global capitalist system as a neo-colonial situation. So, in a sense, to the best of my knowledge, this discourse on neo-colonialism was framed very importantly in that manner by Nkrumah, right? And he argued that this was ever more dangerous and destructive for the South in general, but also for the North. His foretelling was, as regards the course of neocolonialism, as the last stage of imperialism. For Nkrumah, the overarching feature of neocolonialism is the fact that in spite of formal political independence for the countries in the South, their economic system and political policy is directed from outside. I more or less quoted Nkrumah here. This happens through a whole range of economic and financial processes, instruments, etc., but equally importantly, through a physiognomy of what Antonio Gramsci would sort of describe as the many tangles of the superstructure itself, which then goes on to his construction of the ideas of hegemony and so on and so forth. But let me not get into that. So coming back to the idea of neocolonialism, this stranglehold over economy through external actors, that constitutes the theoretical core of neocolonialism, connecting it in very stark ways to the economic architecture of colonialism itself. So there is a continuity then. That control is something which binds both these phases together. Without getting into further details and considerations of Nkruma's analysis, I would like to underscore the significance of the above noted central identifying feature in comprehending the current phase of global capitalism as a very useful starting point, as also its profound significance to characterize the post-World War II global capitalism in general, in terms of describing it, conceptualizing it, etc., as neocolonialism. In other words, we can think in terms of very fine-tuned analysis of neocolonialism, its variants, etc., but this particular idea to me stands in very good stead in terms of giving us a very useful start. As is well known, and I mentioned it earlier, several other prominent scholars and strands within Marxian political economy, in particular during 1950s and 60s, were on similar analytical tracks. Nkrumah may have given it a definition and a name, but if you look at the work of many others during 50s and 60s, I would not dwell on the important similarities, differences, etc., between these different strands, or even a brief overview of their assessments is something which is not possible in this conversation right now, given the time. There is a large literature on all these issues, dealing with the issues and the challenges, concerns that Nkrumah raised, which need not detain us here, but just to mention one of the very important analytical strands who I find, and in particular, a particular scholar who I find very, very impressive, 1950s Political Economy of Growth by Paul Baran. Right? If we engage with that, it becomes very clear that much of what Nkrumah is saying is in very, very important ways is already foretold. Right? But yes, I mean, Baran was not the only one. There are many others associated with the monthly review sort of school, so to say. Many others in the global south, several significant names in India, for instance, or other countries, Amir Bakchi here or Samir Amin are, let's say, just the two very, very well-known names which come to my mind in this context. So that's the important point which is worth keeping on our canvas, on our radar, while discussing these issues, right? Furthermore, as we know, post-World War II global capitalism has undergone very significant structural transformations. And one can think of distinct stages, different phases, etc., as is frequently done. We talk in terms of, for instance, regulated capitalism to neoliberalism, or for that matter, early neocolonialism versus late neocolonialism. All these can be analyzed, and we can investigate and interrogate each one of these in great detail, but I'll stay away from these. I'm only trying to point out that whatever be these different stages, etc., we have something very, very significant and important and powerful, analytically speaking, in terms of the starting point that Nkrumah gives us, along with many other scholars around the same time. I will flag a couple of important markers and features of how do we sort of pinpoint some of the most important processes and so on in a moment. Right? As we look at different dimensions of the global economy currently, different aspects, etc., be it trade in goods and services, investment patterns, finance, the world of work, etc., it is indeed quite clear that contemporary capitalism, contemporary neocolonialism, neoliberal capitalism, whatever you want to call it, has certain very important novel features, certain very important novelties. Right? There is quite a lot to be covered there, but I'll flag only a couple of these. Yeah. One very significant feature, which then shapes everything, all the processes of neocolonialism at this stage, its ramifications, etc. Yeah. One very clear among these features that I like to highlight is the dominance of capital as finance in the global economy as never before. Now, this is a kind of finance capital whose primary thrust is remarkably different from what Hilferding and Lenin and many others had analyzed at the turn of the 20th century, from 19th to 20th, which was one of relatively greater synergy between capital in production and capital as finance. To be sure, rifts and tensions between these two have been part of multiple competitions characterizing components of capital all through. Nonetheless, the kind of disjunction between the two witnessed during the recent decades, in particular the last 5 decades or so, has been unprecedented. This then shapes everything relating to contemporary neocolonialism. This subject has received considerable attention. I'll not get into details, but let me just mention at least a couple of Marxist scholars, Harry Magdoff, Paul Sweezy, Gerald Epstein, Robert Pollin. So, you have a number of Marxist and heterodox scholars who have spent a lot of time analyzing this particular feature. Samir Amin, of course, has contributed massively to this literature. Prabhat Patnaik, Omyo Bagchi, Mariana Mazzucato, and many others. So let me just stop sort of in terms of putting up that list here. Now, this fact is something which is currently very well acknowledged. This particular feature is very well acknowledged by a large number of scholars. This particular feature, marker of the contemporary neo-colonialism. Now, growing financialization of accumulation has impacted adversely on a whole range of macroeconomic outcomes, including investments in the real economy, as the new finance essentially chases speculative gains. Furthermore, as many scholars who I named earlier repeatedly emphasized, apart from incessantly running after speculation and thus contributing to an effective squeeze on capital in production at large, new finance very seriously undermines economic policy space very significantly for the states, particularly in the South, and compresses public investments and expenditures in general. In short, there is a double whammy there via both the market and the state on real economy, with huge deleterious consequences for the world of work, primarily through contraction of employment. As we know, for the last 3-4 decades, people have been talking about, scholars have been talking about jobless growth to now job loss growth and so on. Yeah. The second feature, let me very quickly point out, a notable feature, which then shapes everything in the current episode of neocolonialism, is, and which again has profound implications for the world of work, is relatively much larger direct engagement of metropolitan capital in the third world through investments in production, resulting in considerable and unprecedented dilution of the traditional division of labor that the world had seen hitherto between the North and the South. Now, this again is an exceedingly important feature to keep in mind. People give it various names: supply chains, commodity chains, value chains, and so on. My own preferred expression is global value systems. Right? I'll not get into details of all this, but this happens not always through direct investments in the South, but it in major ways is through simply drawing them into the network via multiple channels. So there's no direct investments, but they become suppliers through whatever capital and whatever investments that they have in their own countries, in their own locations. So through their incorporation without investments, as also through investments, this particular novel feature is a kind of novelty. Again, I mean, it's not entirely new. We can sort of trace it from early days of capitalism, but certainly at the current juncture, this has come as a very, very significant and very important feature, which we need to take note of. Of course, the third and the fourth industrial revolutions, again, have shaped the contours of contemporary neoliberalism, colonialism, etc., neocolonialism in important ways, with very significant implications for the world of work in general and overall economic architecture in the global economy and so on. Now, in all this, all this is happening through many different channels, different dimensions, etc. But as most of us would agree that multinational corporations are at the center of it, of all these processes and so on. So, if in fact, in one of the recent papers, fellow panelist, Professor Aram Ziai, in a very brief but excellent overview of some of these dimensions in his 2020 paper, which is titled as Neo-Colonialism in the Globalized Economy of the 21st Century, an overview, discusses a number of ramifications, features, the processes which are part of the current conjuncture. And I would very strongly urge our participants in this conversation to look at this very illuminating paper, which gives us a very broad sweep, but very kind of useful way of engaging analytically with some of the issues at hand. Right? So the TNCs, MNCs, which occupy the center stage of the global economic architecture, as late Samir Amin used to say, we live in a world of generalized monopolies, right? And he talked of 5 different kinds of monopolies which are at the center of the current architecture and so on, which effectively then go on to control almost every area, is a very, very important feature at the current stage of the current neo-colonialism, or whatever name you want to give it. Just to mention one indicator in terms of the degree of control, etc., as Aram noted in his paper using the UNCTAD data, of the 100 largest multinational companies, more than 80 are headquartered in the North America or Western Europe, 11 in Japan, 4 in China, 1 each in South Korea, Malaysia, and Mexico. And unfortunately for India, there was 1 in India, which then shifted its base to Belgium, ArcelorMittal, right? Like this information which I shared with you from Aram's paper, we have a number of other contributions. For instance, the TNI data, which is regularly updated, which ranks the 100 largest economic entities based on the gross revenues, right? Total revenues. Now that notes that of the 100 largest entities, 71 are corporations, 29 are countries. Now, it's an amazing kind of number that we are talking about. Think of Walmart dealing with the government of Cambodia, right? More than 500 billion kind of company, and or around that, a country whose total GDP is barely a couple of billions and so on. And if you look at in terms of revenues, it's significantly smaller. Right? So,
Praveen, sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
You're pretty close to your time.
Okay. Sorry. Let me just try and rush through, and then maybe some things will come up in Q&A. All right. So a fundamental feature of contemporary neocolonialism, as I see it, contra early neocolonialism, is that the policy and political space, which had been extracted through long-drawn anti-colonial movements, they have suffered huge setbacks during the current phase. And this has generated a kind of free fall in terms of widening of inequalities, iniquities, etc., between the North and the South, along with massive stranglehold and so on. Right? So this is a major kind of ramification of the current phase of neocolonialism that, via monopoly finance capitalism has escalated the drain from the peripheries, but with declining compensation, interestingly, to their own workers, to the workers at the center and so on. Works of Stiglitz and others are very well known. Maybe I can come back in Q&A on these. So, with the choking of the sort of national sovereignty project in the South and near secession of the economic elite from these countries who live there, but practically they have seceded from their own countries in terms of interests and so on. This has contributed to a massive fraying of the social and political basis of the social and political projects in these countries, in the countries of the South. This has further helped monopoly finance capital in the North to escalate its interventions and manipulate conflict situations. And then ultimately all this gives significant push, facilitates the rise of authoritarian regimes. And this is something which we must take note of. So to conclude, I mean, it is quite clear that contemporary neocolonialism is marked by the dominance of giant corporations that are playing with the planet almost with their fingertips, driven by the insatiable accumulation drives. Workers and peoples of the South in the third world have got enmeshed ever more deeply in these games during the current phase. The obvious question then is, what is the way forward? And that would be my last point. Here, we have two dramatically different views within the progressive scholarship. One which in relative minority, I belong to that, is, and this comes from many scholars, someone like Samir Amin wrote a book, very famous book called Delinking. Right? Prabhat Patnaik, he frequently insists on, unless there is significant disconnect from this neoliberal global order, there is no way forward. Right? That's the minority view. The other view, which says that no, adjustments are possible, lots of things can happen within that framework and so on. But personally, I'm very skeptical of that, but we have, a very large body of scholarship which takes that point of view. It is indeed a difficult question. There are no easy answers on the horizon, right? But if any progressive project has to be realized, we probably need to go back to the great Dr. Karl Marx's statement in 1867 that unless workers in the North and South come together, any progress is impossible. let me stop there. And thank you for your time. Sorry for overshooting my time limit. Apologies.
Really good. Thank you so much. That was really very interesting, and I'm sorry I had to interrupt you. But I would really like to invite the audience to write in the Q&A. But in the meantime, I invite the fellow panelists as well to ask if they wish to. But please let me ask you. So, are you saying that the development of India, China, and other parts of the global South, if you like, is incapable of producing, economic benefits to the majority of those populations, that it's structurally incapable of doing so because it is in hoc to these multinational, transnational corporations?
Right. Now, I have to immediately admit that China is a very different case. Sui generis, it kind of, for the kind of regime that we have there and so on. So I think any generalization will not be very appropriate. Nonetheless, certainly from the point of view of what we would describe as working people, workers at large, and so on. No, one of the major concerns in China also has indeed been the gap as regards incomes and other indicators of well-being between them and the rest. In particular, the growing number of billionaires and so on. China, India, Russia, Brazil, etc., have been absolutely fantastic at producing billionaires, right, in the last few decades, and so on and so forth. So, in spite of, let's say, some of my qualifications vis-a-vis China, I would certainly say that even though workers in China have done much better than workers in India, even though the most distressing kind of poverty is certainly a thing of the past for China, for its overwhelming majority of workers, very basic needs have certainly been, very, very basic needs, have certainly been taken care of. Yeah, that is not true of India, for instance. India, in spite of, and as we know, for the last 4 decades, China has been number 1, India has been number 2 in terms of the average growth rates of GDP for almost 4 decades or so. China around double digit, around 10% or so, India around 6% plus or so, right? So the gap has been there, but it's not because of just that gap. It is because of the structure of neocolonialism that operates in both these settings. China, for instance, insisted on technology transfers very early on, right, which certainly has been missing completely from India. China, for instance, has had much better kind of maneuvering of industrial policy, which is completely, withered away in case of India. If you look at the last 3 decades or so, we are very good at talking, in terms of giving slogans and so on, and not only in the last 6-7 years, but also in the earlier period of the neoliberal era. Yeah. So I think in terms of the machinations of global neo-colonialism, which is essentially headquartered in the north, right? My sense is China has not been completely immune, but it has managed to sort of play the game much better than any other country that I know of. Compared to that, India's case has been far poorer.
Just developing that point, one of my colleagues in the department, Sean Stars, has basically asked about China and whether the fact of its so-called socialism with Chinese characteristics provides an alternative. And you've kind of given us an explanation to some extent of domestic Chinese development as being stronger and more independent and more nationally oriented than India's. Do you think that China's global extension, global investments, Belt and Road and others as well, do you think that Chinese model, which has been you say, more successful domestically is also being exported, or is China exporting something which is equally generating inequality in its own investments in Africa, Latin America, other parts of Asia, the Middle East, and so on? Is China different?
Your last sentence is what I would take as the conclusion, and then say that China is not significantly different in that sense. What it is doing on terms and conditions in large parts of Africa, I have been very, very apprehensive of it. Yeah, it does it in much smarter ways. Yeah, but if you look at the kind of indebtedness profiles in many countries in the African continent, yeah, it is pretty disturbing. But of course, it is very different from the old style colonialism, and it would be a kind of a variant of contemporary, let's say, northern neocolonialism. Vis-a-vis, so some of us have often talked in terms of this category called sub-imperialism. Does it make sense? How far can we get any analytical traction from it, and so on? So on those issues, sort of my own assessment of China is far more negative compared to the first issue which you flagged earlier, right? Whether in the context of, let's say, generating profitable avenues which can then help workers in general in these countries, etc., or the processes of appropriation from these countries and so on. Yeah, I think in a strategic sense, it is also trying to kind of put some challenges in the sort of ways of, in particular, the US. But I don't know how far we can say that it has gained a very significant foothold in that broad kind of war game, so to say, right?
Just have one more question before we move to the next speaker, which is that you mentioned, you made a comment about the kind of ruling classes of various countries which have adopted neoliberalism, financialization, and so on, seceding from their own country, and in effect becoming kind of rootless and transnational. And then you said that this inevitably created large amounts of inequality, which then led to authoritarian populism. Could you just please, kind of deepen that, try to explain what you were saying there?
All right. It's certainly the case that they have lock, stock, and barrel. In my assessment, the ruling economic elite in South, in general, of course, to varying degrees, depending on the domestic conditions and so on, yeah, have become what in the old-fashioned literature we used to call comprador bourgeoisie. That I don't think there is a getting away from that. Yeah, of course, China is indeed different. Yeah, but I think for China we probably have to have a very different conversation, maybe. But in general, I'm saying that whether it's even the so-called emerging powers and so on, there is a problem with most of them in this context. But sort of while becoming comprador, it sort of has tried to extract as much from the domestic setting through their support to certain kinds of tendencies which keep the masses under the thumb of certain very powerful forces. Now, as we know, in the case of India, for instance, it has come in the guise of a certain kind of communal authoritarian tendency, and which has become indeed extremely powerful, right? And I mean, industrialists who you would have not imagined, let's say 1980s, to kowtow to them, yeah, to these tendencies, yeah. So they are simultaneously kind of doing both. they are kind of very happy to go along with the global corporate elite and along with these extremely strange, backward kind of looking atavistic, whatever tendencies, forces, and so on, which are shaping the overall social and political canvas, right? Which again is linked to the various factors that we talked about earlier. I hope that makes
Thank you. It's
things
really
somewhat
interesting.
clear. Thank you.
It does. Yeah, it does. Massive questions and massive issues. And unfortunately, we've run out of time for your segment now, but we'll move on. Thank you very much. There are other
Thank you.
questions which people will ask as well in the Q&A. But for now, I think we're moving on to Henning. Yes, Henning, correct. Oh, over to you, Henning. You have about 15 minutes to make your pitch. Thank you.
I'm aware of that. Thank you, Inderjeet, and thank you, Juvaria, and thank you for the invitation. I have selected as a topic global asymmetries and knowledge production to highlight what I believe is not even meriting the term neocolonialism, but actually still colonial when it comes to those global realities. But I will try to explain in those 15 minutes. And I usually, on that subject, am tempted to walk down slightly memory lane, in the sense that I recall when I was visiting a school in Windhoek, then Southwest Africa, of a settler colonial society, nowadays Namibia. We had as a gift a ruler which was donated from a local international bank, British bank. And on that ruler, it said, knowledge is power. Now that merits the question, whose knowledge and who holds the power of definition? What kind of knowledge is translated into power? And it relates to a long debate on analysis of educational systems and how education reproduces fundaments of society, both ideologically and also in material terms, including the shifts of society, which then reproduce new power structures. Bourdieu is one of those who in the 60s published a lot on that. But very soon afterwards, I remember half a century ago with Paulo Freire and Ivan Illich, we also had the counter-narratives who looked behind the smoke screen of knowledge is power, pretending cosmetically that if you learn enough, you make a career and you contribute to social progress, which to some extent is right, because if you're good at that, you contribute to your individual progress within the given social system. But how much is that knowledge having the potential to transform a social system, which you would think is not reflecting the fundamental values you would like to strive for? And that leads me to something which is a challenge for the epistemological decolonization of today, a very much current topical issue since a few years in decolonial discourses, which have taken ground for good reasons, or actually for bad reasons, but good that they took the ground. And there's a strong emphasis on this epistemological decolonization. But there are pitfalls and traps, because don't be misled. Epistemological decolonization does not transform power relations and structures, and does not eliminate marginalization. Because so far it plays out mainly in the arena and the fora defined by the systems in existence. That's not an argument against that, but it's basically a warning not to believe that we are having entered a kind of a revolutionary transformation. We might be able to affect discourses, but that does not mean that we affect the fundamental structures which reproduce societies and the asymmetric power relations, neither domestically nor on a global scale. Let me use 2 or 3 examples. The Zimbabwean South African scholar Zabelo Dlovu-Gacheni, now at the University of Bayreuth, is one of the most pronounced scholars advocating a pedagogy of unlearning, which he calls a part of epistemological decolonization, which results in the removal of that colonial or Eurocentric hard disk of coloniality together with its software. But that is easier said than done, given the existing power structures. And more often than we realize, our own affirmative involvement is determined by the mere position we occupy and the roles we execute. Therefore, it's necessary to throw a spanner in the current spinning wheel of popular demands for decolonization. Of course, not to distract them, but to point at these pitfalls and traps. Wabi Long, a psychologist in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cape Town, warns us of the all too often uncritical affirmation of post-colonial theory. As he observes, and I quote, "Decolonization seals us within a colonial imaginary in which the binaries of colonizer and colonized, white and black, become impossible to displace." For him, and he elaborates that in the South African post-apartheid situation, which I think can also be applied to other societies, for him, decolonization activists, by and large, do not seem to take issue with the instrumentalization of their education. Instead of a materialist reading of the asymmetries of academic life, they support a decolonization agenda that centers on the notion of epistemic violence. That emphasis, however, forms the ideological superstructure, he continues, of an identity project. The focus on epistemic violence therefore risks to reduce, if not ignore, the underlying dimensions of material facts and realities. To put it in a little bit of a flippant observation, while the demands of South African students that Rhodes must fall were absolutely legitimate and deserved to be supported, the big question remains, with the removal of the Rhodes monument from the University of Cape Town, has that increased the success rates of the students passing the same location without Rhodes sitting there on the monument in their final exams? And I dare to say statistically, no, it did not. And again, let me emphasize, it's not a counter argument against the removal of the monument, nor is there a counter argument against renaming colonial street names wherever in the world. But the question remains, and the answer is obvious, to what extent does that improve the material living conditions of those beggars now sitting on a street name where the colonial name has been replaced by one of the era of post-colonial liberation? That points to the fact that we need to focus on the material conditions and structures reproduced in societies. It was indirectly touched upon in the just now debate about the role of China, not only domestically, but also as a new, highly influential and relevant global actor when it comes to economic relations with other societies. We need to look behind the smoke screen. The awareness of the asymmetric North-South or any other given power relations does not eliminate the risk of perpetuating these, even within the settings of groups who claim to oppose them. Their repositioning might risk to enter new pitfalls. Hamid Dabashi, for example, who teaches Iranian studies and comparative literature at Columbia University, points out that so-called progressive political philosophical trajectories are by no means secure scaffolding. With reference to the philosopher Slavoj Žižek, he warns that such philosophy does not protect from falling prey to what he calls, I quote, the discrete charm of European intellectuals. And I entirely agree. But the same is true the other way around. Cultivating the anti-European, anti-Northern, anti-Western counter-narratives is not yet any guarantee to effectively dismantle and remove the disparities of power applied. So that's the dilemma. And while I point at that, another personal note, I have a moral and ethical problem. I can afford to be vocal about that as a retired scholar who is not facing an early or midterm career in academia, because I can afford to opt out. I publish blogs, I publish in open access journals, I publish in newspapers, and I couldn't care less. But witnessing younger scholars in their early or mid-career, they are in a prison. And that prison is not only defined by Western universities, maybe some of them even provide more maneuvering space, like having such a webinar. These are the universities on a global scale which reproduce the same parameters and criteria. And these include publishing in peer-reviewed international journals of a handful of commercial publishing houses operating on a global scale, but based in the UK, in Germany, Switzerland, and in the USA, where you do your publication free of charge, where the reviewers review free of charge, but where if you want to read the article, you have to pay £45. And if you want to have a copy of the printed journal, as a dinosaur as I am, they offer you generously that you can buy one at 50% discount. This is part of our material realities, and they are globally applicable. South African universities offer rewards to their scholars more so if they publish in these journals than in very excellent local journals, which at times are even open access. The same applies to the funding structures scholars are basically confronted to make use of. Funding structures in the industrialized countries provide money, but not to create a level playing field. They don't allocate sufficient money to Southern counterparts, even if they are part of the project proposals. They do not provide the money that you publish open access and locally and in a language where those people who are researched can follow and understand. They fund knowledge production for Western societies within the given academic setting. And thereby even we, with very fancy, very revolutionary, very critical, self-critical agendas, to a certain extent, enter the trap where we reproduce the same system against which we argue with our analysis. I'm afraid I can't offer you the solution to that. unless I would say, try to become a pensioner and then you are able to say what I am saying. So I have to leave it to you and my time is almost up. Let me just end by another quote by Walter Mignolo, who warns of the conservation, the expansion, and the changing of the structure of knowledge, but all within the perpetuation of a colonial matrix of power. Which means, in conclusion to the debate we just started the last 30 minutes, it's not neocolonialism we are talking about. It's plain and simple colonialism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That was really interesting, if a little bit depressing. But we have a question on the Q&A, which I think is really pertinent. Again, from Sean Stars, who's just started in our department quite recently. He says, thank you very much for your presentation. He asks, would you go further and argue that not only does pulling down statues, renaming streets and so on do very little or nothing to address disparities, but that focusing only on these decolonizing efforts actually is a class project to counter those who say that we need to challenge ruling class material power?
I'm tempted not to agree because it's very provocative. I understand the intention and I appreciate the intention, but I'm not entering that trap. Of course, it's important to challenge dominant cultures as part of self-critical reflections. Of course, it's important to discuss, should there really be a Rhodes monument still on display at one of the most international renowned British places of higher learning? The debate has a function. I would not say it's just, you know, a hidden agenda to reproduce the core interests. I think the at times even vicious responses by white supremacy now to Black Lives Matter, which created new global alliances in a hitherto unseen coalition of people all over the world. White supremacists, the censorship, and especially in the UK, what I follow, but also in Germany, it's exactly the same. That is a response that we have managed to enter territory, to create visibility that did not exist before. And that might be scary for some. So if they wouldn't be scared, they would say, okay, go ahead, go so, and okay, let's discuss it and let's add the thinkers and the contributions, that long debate that was 2-3 years ago at SOAS from the global south, which does not mean you eliminate Kant or Hegel or whoever, what they say, but that response shows to me that they are under threat by the discourse, because the discourse has the potential to create awareness, which you can turn into more than that, to the end of what Praveen said, which you can turn into class-oriented action. So I would not argue against it. I would just all the time eagerly point out it's not enough, and don't think you are liberated because you have removed the statue or you have changed a name of a street.
Thank you, Henning. Aram would like to ask a question.
Yes, I think in part you have already answered it right now, but I was actually having some bad feelings about this opposition that we just have encountered again between material and discursive practice, and you either battle for one or for the other, and the post-colonial camp then being identified with those concerned only with discourses. And I think that's, well, it may be an accurate description of some post-colonial work, but certainly not of all. And also the example you gave of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, I think you're perfectly right in pointing out the material dimension. How much has it helped the students that the statue is not there if racial discrimination is still prevalent? But the Rhodes Must Fall movement was immediately succeeded by the fees must fall movement. So I think that many of these post-colonial activists are very aware of the necessity and importance of these material structures, and I'm a bit worried that the call we need to focus on material relations would then be falling back again behind the insight that basically it's not enough to talk about the economic relations of power. We also have to talk about racism. We also have to talk about gender. And yeah, and I think this insight that basically racism and gender are serious and crucially important relations of oppression should, of course, not lead us to the idea that they are the only ones in town, and that basically we need to, I think we probably can agree on that, we need to basically take into account all of them. And we must, of course, not forget the material practices and relations of power. But I'm just a bit scared that the post-colonialists, including Stuart Hall and Spivak and some other from the Marxist camp, would then be identified with this, yeah, they're dealing with the cultural issues and are forgetting about the material issues. And yeah, I think that would not do justice to all of them, at least.
Well, I really hope I didn't come across with that oversimplification. And as you rightly said, my answer already highlighted that, of course, it's not an either or. It's more that sometimes people tend to forget that. And I'm just eager to stress that aspect. There's another aspect which I didn't touch on, but which is a risk to keep an eye on, that if we are not careful in checking the discourses, we are promoting identitarian politics. And that is toxic. So we need to be aware when it comes to the epistemological side that we need to avoid othering and otherness in a way where you basically sabotage potential alliances. And I say that because I was, as a visiting professor on the UCT campus at the height of Fees Must Fall, and I was a bit scared to see this identity politics developing where white students were excluded, no matter what they had to say, from any discourse based on the fact of their whiteness. Now that's a very dangerous trap. And that's, of course, where we need to support this awareness, which already Frantz Fanon not in Wretched of the Earth, but in Black Skin, White Masks in the early 1950s already ended. I can recommend everyone to go back and read Black Skin, White Masks, and especially the last 15 pages, where he very clearly based his anti-racist, fundamentally anti-racist approach to building alliances on truly universal values, which taken serious do not know color or sex. It has a different fundament. And that is something not to lose sight of. But of course, Aram, it's not an either or. We should do both. I mean, like any efforts to transform societies cannot be a one-point focused issue. It's more than that. And one aspect we need also to keep in mind is we not only have to talk about that, we have to start inside ourselves. The longest journey is the journey within. We need to start to self-critically reflect, how were we socialized? Where are the traps we enter ourselves? And how can we start by trying to change those? That's, for me, a very important first step, because it also creates credibility and integrity when I talk about things to others.
Henning, I wonder if I might just ask another couple of questions. I mean, one of those is you make a distinction between identity politics and maybe material or materialist politics, but aren't a lot of oppressions and hierarchies and inequalities actually rooted in racism and gender and patriarchy and so on as well? So how do you distinguish between what you call toxic identity politics and the legitimate identity politics, which does recognize and have to recognize that there is racial oppression and inequality and exploitation, as well as gender exploitations and so on, so that women and racial minorities do occupy this double or treble kind of exploitation, not just class, but also gender and race, for example. And there is obviously a legitimacy to that kind of a struggle. And the origins of identity politics in the 60s and 70s initially was recognizing that in addition to class, there was gender and there was race, and that the two, they had to be unified and so on, and not against one another, but considered part of. And so I just wonder where you draw the lines between legitimate and illegitimate, if you like, identities.
I thought I was clear on that. I think you need to have a framework of universal values you relate to, but that does not exclude that you need to first go your own way. Like Black consciousness in South Africa, where white liberal students cried foul and said, oh, how can you exclude us? They were never anti-white in that sense. Steve Biko was laughing at them. He said, or like the same time I experienced that, I had this parallel experience in Southern Africa and in West Berlin, where I was studying between the feminist movement and the Black consciousness movement. And the mechanisms were exactly the same. The men who were crying foul, oh, you have women's groups and you exclude us. Bullshit. Of course it's necessary. You need to create your own space. You need to discover your human dignity, self-respect, and then you enter. Toxic is if the next step would be all whites are enemies, all men are enemies. That would be the toxic side. And that's a toxic side of identity politics from above. And I was basically just saying we need to be aware that we don't practice or reproduce the same patterns with identity politics from below. That's the important point, because then we enter the same trap again of asymmetric power relations. So we are not aware that we reproduce exactly the mindset which we claim to fight against. That's the challenge.
Just one last question. So, okay, so to some extent, the symbolic value of the toppling of a statue, the renaming of a street, or the changing, as in the City University's case, the changing of the name of the business school from a slave-owning individuals to a mathematician, Bayes. What do you say are the most expansive limits to the power of scholars and intellectuals in actually generating significant or radical change? That is, where we are, what we do, and the positions we occupy, and there are all sorts of exploitations about these journals you were talking about and so on. But at the same time, there's quite a lot of privilege. There's quite a lot of spare time and time for us to live and work and think and read and discuss like this and in other fora too. So we have that sort of space, if you like. What do you think are the kind of, at the most, that you would think that the roles that we occupy enable us to be able to achieve in terms of progress on the material and symbolic fronts?
Well, I think the first thing is the limits, the institutionalized limits are that by changing the name of the institution, you do not change the character of the institution. So it means what follows the name change as a symbolic flagging that you want to have a different institution. And then we should spend certain amount of times not publishing the next article, which adds to our career, but maybe discussing in staff meetings with students how we can empower other forces which might impact on it. To discuss, is there a way that universities modify their criteria where they give recognition to academic achievements, that you redefine what is an academic achievement, that you redefine what are the kinds of knowledge, which are actually respected in their diversity? What are the kinds of communications? I mean, there's such a lot. And as I said at the beginning, I can't offer you a solution, but to spend time on those reflections, interact with the allies and say, okay, at the next meeting of the department, we would like to discuss this or that. And then maybe get the universities also to approach the national funding agencies or the philanthropy foundations and say, have you been aware that we reproduce a system while you fund research how to change the system? And does not that need to impact on changing the funding structures, even if it means that I get one project less for the next years to come, or get half of the fees I would otherwise get? So that would be the kind of territory where I think there would be time and energy well spent.
Yeah, and that would be incredible transformative change in the whole institutional environment as well. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Henning. That's really thought-provoking. And I think, as you say, we have to reach within to know who you are and then work out what it is you can and cannot do and ally with others. And I think that's great, practical. And I hope you'll be able to write some of this up so that we can use that to sort of spread that same kind of word as well. But thank you so much, Henning. That was a really great Q&A as well as presentation. Okay, now we are moving on to Aram's presentation. So Aram, I'll hand it over to you. You have about 15 minutes or so, and then followed by the same kind of Q&A period. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Inderjeet, and also thanks, Juvaria. Thanks to both of you for organizing this whole webinar series, which has been really fascinating. I would like to share my screen and give a short presentation during the next, hopefully, almost 15 minutes. And yeah, it's entitled Partnership and Colonialism in Development Cooperation. So I'm not going to provide detailed analysis of particular development projects, but more think about the broader strokes and the broader structures. So this is an overview over what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to start right away with the oft quoted Truman Address of 1949, where the US president announced a bold new program for the underdeveloped areas. And here it is already very visible that he was taking great care to distance this new program from an old program, from the old imperialism, exploitation for foreign profit. And instead, he talked about a program of development based on democratic fair dealing. So if we now here in the middle of the 20th century have a new program which is characterized by the idea of partnership and democratic fair dealing, let us briefly remember the old program, which was announced or which was formulated among others by one of his predecessors, by US President Roosevelt at the beginning of the 20th century. And in this quote, he talks about the United Nations being such a peaceful nation, desiring cordial friendship with all others, with one exception. Wars with barbarous peoples are something completely different. So one can be a peaceful country and still go to war with a barbarous region, because this is a necessary international police duty which must be performed for the sake of mankind. So wars with barbarous peoples are an international police duty for the sake of mankind. So here we have this clear differentiation between nations which deserve to be treated peacefully and others which do not. And this is complemented by another quote I've given on the bottom of the page, which was exactly at that time dealing with the issue of torture in a colony of the United States in the Philippines. And the torture is being justified by some US experts, or I think British experts on the Philippines, because it is being blamed on the victims themselves. So the colonized actually, through their insidious character, force the colonizers to exert violence and even to torture them. So this was the old program. So, and it is actually not that far away, beginning of the 20th century. So what had happened between 1901 and 1949? And my claim is, in particular, two things: the growth of anti-colonial movements and of workers' movements up to the point of revolutions. Here as examples, on the left-hand side, Lenin, on the right-hand side, Gandhi and Sarojini Naidu, as icons for two of these revolutions. And because of this, here I would agree to the Post-Development School and Majid Janema, there was a need for a new program. Ranema writes, development was an ideology born and refined in the North to meet the needs of the dominant powers in search of a more appropriate tool for their economic and geopolitical expansion, because the old tool, colonialism, had lost legitimacy. And this new ideology helped transform the obsolete colonialism to an even sometimes attractive instrument to recapture new ground. So the study, which the most in-depth study I know at least, which was concerned with the origin of this idea of the development of the global South, concludes, and this is Javier Alcalde, the first function of the idea of development was to give economic activity a positive and essential meaning for the lives of less developed peoples, enhancing a linkage between capitalism and well-being in the South. So this is what it was originally about. And if we look at Truman's address in a certain perspective, we actually see he wasn't even squeamish about it. He was openly admitting that, yes, of course, it is about helping the poor people achieve a better standard of living, but this is going to happen through a partnership which involves a win-win situation. So here again, we have this lengthy quote, but it is clear that it is also about the cooperation of business and private capital, and that raising the standards of living in the South is being done through commerce, which we also will benefit from. So here we have the original idea. There is no conflict between a partnership and between capitalist investment. And this is at the core, at the bottom, basically, of the whole enterprise of development cooperation, of this bold new program that Truman has outlined as a new program of partnership. So it's a very specific kind of partnership, believing in the benefits of capitalism. So, nevertheless, I would argue we can still see that the new discourse of development had some continuities and also some discontinuities. But first of all, we have to diagnose that development cooperation was established as a program designed to legitimate the capitalist world order in the global South through the promise of affluence, the promise of development, after the colonial order had appeared increasingly illegitimate. So what are then the continuities? What are the discontinuities? In this new partnership, which was announced as something other than the old imperialism, which elements of the new imperialism, of the old imperialism, can still be found there? So continuities, I would say central points are the superiority of the self, from the US perspective, one's own society, and the inferiority of the other societies in the South. And now the mission to civilize the uncivilized is easily replaced by the mission to develop the underdeveloped. And also the basic idea of a convergence of interest is still there. It is in the interest of the countries of the global South that we go there and try to do business and have access to the raw materials, to the resources. and not any longer as in the colonial discourse, because they benefit from being civilized, but now they benefit in terms of having a higher standard of living as a consequence. This at least is the promise of development given in this new program. However, there are also central discontinuities, and I think these should not be underestimated. This is something that I see in some scholars, which basically argue, well, we are still in the era of colonialism, not much has changed. I think the crucial point, of course, the crucial discontinuity was the recognition of non-European peoples' capability for self-rule. This was clearly denied after World War I. It could no longer be denied after World War II. Another discontinuity in the new program, that the discourse which was legitimizing this program, and this was this new discourse of development, was talking about its object not in biological terms, but in predominantly economic and geographic terms. So it was about underdeveloped regions instead of uncivilized peoples. Okay, so what if we now ask about the colonial elements in development cooperation? What are these elements? Where do we see them? And I would argue there are at least 3 elements which seem pertinent. And the first one is the general idea of evolutionism, the idea of the universal scale with Europe on top. Ashish Nandi has talked about the transformation of geocultural differences into historical stages. Henning Melber has also talked about the same issue already 30 years ago in a brilliant book, which unfortunately only has appeared in German, I think. And he talked about the chronification of differences. And what both Nandi and Henning mean is the same operation of perceiving difference only exclusively in terms of backwardness. And this is linked to this universal scale that all societies, all human societies, transform themselves in a similar manner. There's just one pattern. So this is the first element. The second element, taken over from colonial discourse, is the idea of trusteeship. The idea that there are experts with superior knowledge about social transformation, and this knowledge can legitimize interventions even against the will of the affected people. In colonialism, this was absolutely clear. You cannot ask the savages how they want their society to be transformed, because the colonizers possess this superior knowledge. Now, the picture I gave here is the Saraswati Dam in the Narmada Valley in India, which has in its history displaced several hundreds of thousands of people, predominantly Adivasi people. So, and this already shows that this trusteeship in the era after colonialism, in the era of the independent India, has been taken over by experts which were Indians themselves, but which displayed the same contempt for the will of the affected people, invoking again the benefit for the greater common good, as Arundhati Roy put it, or were arguing simply in the name of development. In the name of development, this project has to be built, and you, I'm afraid, you are now losing your existence. This is something which is happening, according to scholars, on development-induced displacement on such a massive scale that one could hardly believe the numbers. But these scholars, and it is not one, and it's a bunch of scholars, and they're telling us that 10 to 15 million people lose their livelihoods each year because of development projects, because of projects which are supposed to benefit them. So third point and last point, exploitation. Now, if we go back to this original function that Alcalde has identified, one can still say that development cooperation is still seen as something which can legitimize, for the most part of the countries of the South, still colonial division of labor. And it can also legitimize the continuous transfer of money which is taking place in the current world order from the South to the North. So the picture, I don't know if it's too small, if you can recognize it, but according to numbers of the European Network on Debt and Development, we have a net transfer of resources from the South to the North by the order of 1,000 billion US dollars per year. So there's a transfer of actually $2,000 billion in terms of debt service, repatriations of profits of multinational corporations, illicit financial flows. But on the other hand, there's also, of course, money transferred to the Global South in terms of lending, in terms of official development assistance, and in terms of direct investment. But the net transfer is still that 1,000 billion US dollars are being extracted from the South up until this very day. So now this is, of course, not the fault of development cooperation, but development cooperation provides, first of all, some fig leaf through this official development assistance, because it conveys the message, yes, there is a problem of global, and we're doing something about it. Look at all our projects. While if poverty reduction was taken serious, one would have to change the structures of the global economy. But this is, of course, off limits. This is not something that development cooperation wishes to talk about. And this includes explicitly the Sustainable Development Goals. Even worse than that, in development cooperation, in parts of development cooperation, in some development projects, we are still confronted with private investment promotion, public-private partnerships, microcredits, which are still carrying on the myth of the win-win solution. It is possible to reduce poverty within global capitalism if we make use of market forces. So trying to help the poor without questioning the system of inequality producing global capitalism. So I'm coming to an end. Ways forward, this is my last slide. Decolonizing development cooperation. So what can we do about it? Now, this is, of course, all a very rough sketch, but some ideas may be useful. If we want to reject evolutionism and the idea that the European industrial capitalist societies are superior, we should look to alternatives. What alternatives to Western models are there? And how can we measure a good society apart from taking over the idea of the World Bank and looking at the gross domestic product? So here we could use new indicators like the Happy Planet Index, which looks at life expectancy, but also looks at inequality. It looks at subjective happiness of the people, and it looks at the carbon footprint. And according to this measuring, the good societies, still on a universal scale, but a very different universal scale, are then not to be found in the affluent North, but more predominantly in middle income countries which manage to combine higher life expectancies with lower carbon footprints. And if I'm saying now the Western models, I would like to remind ourselves that these models, which have become hegemonic in the West, but which are by no means uncontested, and which are no cultural traits of the West in that sense. So instead of invoking Gandhi, one could also invoke someone like Robert Kennedy, who in a speech to students of the University of Kansas was portraying, measuring the gross domestic product as an indicator of progress as entirely absurd, even as dangerous. And instead, he talked about indicators of a good society like the beauty of our poetry, the intelligence of our public debate, or the joy of our children. things which are maybe hard to measure, but things which are of course easily agreeable as signs, as features of a good society. So, second point, rejecting trusteeship. And here I think what is crucial, especially from this perspective of the people suffering from losing their livelihood through development projects, here I think the introduction of accountability mechanisms would be crucial. And the most prominent of these accountability mechanisms is, of course, the World Bank Inspection Panel headed by Imrana Jalal here on the right, because it gives a voice to those people for whose benefit these projects are actually supposed to be. And I think this is a step in the right direction. Although in the long term, I think, of course, we have to talk about radical democracy. Because after all, discussions about development are discussions how people should be living, how people want to live. And there are no experts on this issue apart from the people themselves. At least this would be my position. So last point, rejecting exploitation. So the short-term goal would then be stopping privatizations and public-private partnerships. And the longer-term goals would be delegitimizing capitalism and building up communal alternatives. One very interesting example, of course, in Chiapas, the Zapatista movement, representatives of which have just recently been touring around Europe and have been engaging in discussions with grassroots initiatives and leftists in Europe. So I guess my time is up. So I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Muted for a bit, but thank you so much. I really appreciate both the analysis, but also the fact that you're looking to see what kind of alternatives to the existing kind of position are maybe available, and that's really very interesting. And what I perhaps there is a question in the Q&A, if I can have a quick look. Again, it's from Sean, who asks, you said that the transfer of $2 trillion from the south to the north is, quote, not the fault of development. And he says he uses that video in his development class. But isn't this transfer the very purpose of international development? To build infrastructure, to make wealth extraction a lot easier via production, transportation, and turn peasants into workers and consumers, again, to increase wealth extraction.
Yeah. I would agree if we define development as basically the universalization of global capitalism. But I was saying development cooperation. And in development cooperation, there are many people telling, yes, but I'm working at this organization and we're doing this project and we're, yeah, sometimes they are in fact engaging in projects which are not concerned with infrastructure for wealth extraction, but which are concerned then with empowerment of adolescent girls or with social projects of any kind. And in this context, I'm a bit hesitant to be too massive in my critique. So for this type of development cooperation, I would say, yes, there may be benefits which are being which are the outcome of projects such as these. However, they are then the fig leaf sort of distracting from the wealth extraction which is then taking place in the global economy.
And I guess you could say, from what you were describing about colonialism to kind of neo-colonialism and development, in a way, the extraction of surplus, which was much more direct, brutal, and obvious, highly visible by one group of people from one group to another, in the post-colonial period, or the kind of Trumanesque period of development, becomes less and less visible overtly, but the kind of work that you do and that others have done continues to uncover and make more visible the transfers. But at the same time, that possibly means that if there's enough traction, then that exerts pressure on the big institutions who are forced to face and recognize that the practices they've engaged in, overtly or covertly, have to change as well. So I guess the question I'm asking is, a lot of people say that you need this revolutionary transformation. There are others who say, look, in the absence of that immediate revolutionary moment, there's actually a lot of other things that are being done and can be done. And where do you sort of look at the balance of that, I guess, in your own understanding of change? Because some people would say, well, that piecemeal reform undermines that revolutionary potential as well. And there's that kind of constant dilemma. Do you fight for change and reform, even anything better than what it is at the moment, but also perhaps knowing that it takes a little bit of the wind out of the more radical transformation as well?
This is perfectly true, and I would agree to all of what you said. I think I'm trying to find the balance between not showing contempt for the piecemeal solutions which are possible within the existing system and which are desperately necessary for the people suffering in the system. While on the other hand, also bearing in mind that basically we need to look out for larger transformations. So, and this is why basically I'm very sympathetic to the post-development school, which says, well, we have to fundamentally change everything. Basically, following the footsteps of Ivan Illich, which has been mentioned before by Henning, who had a radical critique of industrial modernity, saying that basically it is a threat to people's autonomy, and it is exploiting the people. So, but on the other hand, I see that some reform initiatives actually do have effects and results which should not be neglected, and especially from the perspective of those who maybe have not the luxury to wait for the huge revolution to come.
Yeah,
and I think it can be combined. I think we can try to find steps into the right direction and support movements and protests, and also change our own practices in a way which anticipate a society which would be less based on competition, but more based on solidarity.
Sure. And, so Juvaria, do you want to?
No, I'll let you finish your point. I just wanted to ask something a little different.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, sure then. Thanks. In that case, I just wanted to sort of pick up on your latter few points where you, you sort of present this roadmap for how to decolonize. And you mentioned rejecting trusteeship, and then you mentioned rejecting exploitation. So, and these were interesting for me because they're quite well fleshed out, right? So you have the example of the World Bank, and you have specific examples like privatization and the PPPs. But are we, so where do you sort of, how do you navigate that? Like, are you sort of rejecting specific mechanisms altogether? Is it possible to sort of say that, or is that still sort of considered radical?
I'm not sure if I'm getting entirely what you're asking, but specific mechanisms such as microcredit, such as public-private partnerships. Yes, I think it is possible to do that on the basis of the assumption. No, I do not believe that it is possible to combine poverty reduction with the promotion of capitalism, because this is what essentially the microcredit idea is. And I think it has spectacularly failed in parts of India and in Bangladesh. So, and yeah, and I think this is what at least the radical faction should be more openly criticize, the belief within development cooperation that it still can be done, that we can help the poor without hurting the rich. I think this, in a somewhat simplified formula, is what development cooperation has been trying to do the past 7 decades. And I wouldn't say it has been an utter failure, but the successes have been so thin, and they have been accompanied by widening inequality. So I think it should be, yeah, I think it is time to become more radical in our demands.
Actually, that takes me to a question which we didn't get to after Praveen finished his talk, but it was from one of our very good friends and a City University research fellow based in New Delhi, Atul Bhardwaj, who asked about the relevance of Marxism today, and he wanted to address to you that particular question, that kind of revolutionary Marxism, which I think you, to some extent, you expressed. How practically relevant is it? Politically relevant is it?
Yes.
And politically viable is it today?
No, in any case, there are varieties of politically relevant. I mean, what do we mean by politically relevant? That's a very good question to ask in the first place. Right? But before that, I think I'm very fond of a statement by Jean-Paul Sartre on relevance of Marxism, which said that, it is impossible to transcend Marxism as long as there is capitalism, because as a method, you don't have anything else, right? And then again, when we think of Marxism, what is Marxism? Again, I mean, these are sort of very profound, very kind of complex questions and so on. Fundamentally, I see it as a method, and as a method, I mean, I think the richness that it offers to us in terms of everything that we have discussed today, from, let's say, Aram's vantage point, or Henning's vantage point, or many other conversations that we have, I would be very happy to kind of incorporate that in that broad canvas, right? In terms of the method as such,
Sure.
Yeah. Specifics, specific positions, etc. On that we certainly differ. I mean, that's perfectly fine. Yeah. At the end of the day, I think there are two core issues. One is sort of the question of theorizing and analysis itself, and are we doing the right thing or not at that level? Some of the challenges and contradictions in our conversation have clearly shown the limits of some of our positions. Let me put it that way. Yeah, we don't have time to get into details. Second is the question of, obvious question of the politics. I mean, what can take us forward in small ways, limited ways, with a view on the larger trajectory, etc., that Aram was talking about. Again, I mean, no easy answers, but to my mind, I think it is more or less, as I see the way I conceptualize Marxist method, it is difficult to transcend that. I mean, let me put it that way. But as I said, that itself begs the question of what are the aspects of that method we can get into. For instance, the simple-minded modernity. Marx starts with that and rejects that completely. Yeah. The letter, he takes 4 years to respond to Vera Jesulich, right? Whether we can transcend capitalism to go to socialism in the context of Russia or not. He says, yes, indeed. And so, so much more there. Agrarian question, the kind of caricatures that we have had in the Eurocentric knowledge and the representations of Marx, appalling. Yeah. So, but as I said, I mean, we don't really have time to get into all these things. So we really have to be much more nuanced in terms of this sort of our own understanding of the method as such. Sorry, if I've sounded a bit,
No, just a question that occurs to me. I mean, nowadays, and since 2008-9 in particular, the BBC, not known for its
yes,
Marxism, The Economist, also not known for their Marxism, and others, Financial Times and so on and so forth, have recognized that the theory
absolutely.
of crisis put forward by Marx works. It works when others don't. So I don't think that, I mean, I just wanted to hear what you had to say, but it does strike me that the question I've got is that we all deal with the global south here to some extent or other. Is the global south the kind of cockpit of revolutionary movements and change, which is going to lead the world, given the change division of labor, which has occurred in the last 40, 50 years? With
You see, my sense, sorry,
yeah,
sorry, I was saying that my sense is that the prospect and possibilities of radical politics are possibly far more in the global south than in the global north. Right? Whether that would materialize or not, of course, depends on finally the kind of engagements and mobilizations and practices, etc., which has not been very heartening in the recent times. In the recent times, as it happens, we have, in fact, got into more and more retrogressive kind of trajectories. Yeah, and when Henning was talking about sort of demolishing some statues and renaming this roads, etc., I was also thinking of how that can not only aggravate an identity kind of or identitarian kind of politics, but almost a fascist politics. Yeah, with the othering of sort of whatever else, eulogizing something which was non-existent. And Inderjeet, you probably would know it very well, since I imagine you keep tracking India. Yeah, what is happening in this country at this moment? So the dangers of that. Yeah. So, and I mean, I can also, based on my brief acquaintances with other parts of the world, seem to feel very uneasy in terms of the current juncture, in terms of political practice, where I very strongly feel that smoke screens of various kinds are probably taking us away from something much more substantive.
You mentioned Gramsci in part of your remarks at the beginning, and his interest, very interesting analysis of emotion, irrationality, of politics and political rhetoric and discourse. And I just wonder whether perhaps, while the materialist analysis is very significant and profound, but I wonder whether the materialist politics in materialist ways is sufficient to actually use those things we know about how people are mobilized, how kind of from where we are to where we want to be, that most people are not materialist or idealists. They are just people with histories and complexities and all kinds of sedimented ideas and superstitions and religions and so on. But we operate very often on the terrain of the material. We have all sorts of statistics at our disposal. We can go to X, Y, and Z and bring them all out and show the graphs of the transfers of wealth and power and income and so on. And they don't listen, because there's this other message which is going on, which is so compellingly put, which then takes people's minds, if you like,
Yes.
at
You
that
know, I
macro
can't
level.
agree more with you on this, because that has been a massive failure of uh, let's say, the progressive kind of political mobilization efforts, which remain trapped in that material discourse itself. You can see it everywhere. Why is it that we have become so irrelevant? Why is it that nobody listens to us? Right? Now, how do we do better politics? That's a much more difficult question, Inderjeet, and I have no simple kind of answer to that. But somewhere, I think in the earlier conversation, both Aram and Henning kind of tried to, engage with that issue. But we need to flesh it out in much greater detail. Yeah.
Sure.
So
I just want to thank you so much. Thank you. I just want to give Henning a chance to come in, because obviously, you have a position on so much of that which has been said since your own intervention and the Q&A. I just wonder if you have the last word, perhaps, for this evening, so that we can let our colleagues go and enjoy what's left of a Friday. Henning.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
I think what is important is, when going back to your question about the relevance of Marxism today, as a theory, an analytical tool, it hasn't lost any value. And Marx himself said it would be utterly un-Marxist not to modify and adjust the theory according to the changes of societies. So we need to keep in mind, and that relates, of course, to earlier parts of the exchange, that class analysis matters. And defining class interest matters, because it allows us to look at reasons for certain politics which are otherwise not as obvious. And that is inspired by Marxist theory and different schools of thought within the panorama of Marxist theory. I very much appreciated Nikos Poulantzas, for example, when it comes to state theory. So Marxism is not one homogeneous set. We have a lot of things which we can benefit from in the type of analysis. And that also means, if you apply Marxist analysis, then you apply it in a domestic context and you apply it in a global context. And that leads me to your other question about if the global south would be the vanguard, so to say. I think it's a misleading question, because you have class interest in any of those societies. And India is indeed one of the very obvious cases at the moment where one is it sends me shivers down the spine to see this reactionary populism unfolding, as little as I know about India. So it means you apply the analysis to each society, and then you see who are the allies and who are on the other side. But you do the same in the global context, where you then form global alliances. And there is where Marxist theory, going back almost 200 years, is kind of outdated. It's not the global proletariat that leads the class struggle these days. Those in many countries who still are employed in blue-collar jobs, they won't risk their jobs because the alternative is unemployed. So, of course, class struggles will take different forms, different social movements. Aram pointed to the Zapatistas. So we have many of those examples, and they might not even come across in the form of class struggles. Conviviality is a very important new approach, and it would be difficult to market that as class struggle, but it is related to how best to induce social changes, how to promote alliances, and how to take matters further. If you allow me one last point to the dilemma I pointed out before, relating to what Aram was challenged. Of course, if development cooperation creates schools in walking distance for kids, even if, as I suggested, these schools domesticate you in a sense I would not want to see. I would find it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to argue against that. And that is exactly the dilemma we are confronted with. If development cooperation is able to save a few lives more than without development cooperation, are we then able to take a high stand and say we have to get rid of development cooperation? And I think we are, and that brings me back to Marx's theory, and then I stop. Marx emphasized the contradictions in societies, and they have not changed. Well, they have changed in the way they appear, but the contradictions continue to exist, and we are confronted with the challenge, how do we position ourselves in societies and on a global scale, which is full of contradictions.
Well, I think you summed it up very nicely there, Henning. Thank you so much. We have reached 1801 in London, and much later in New Delhi. I'm scared to even say it. Thank you so much, Praveen, for bearing with us and contributing so strongly. To Aram also for arranging this panel, and for Henning and their insights, your insights. We hope that you will find time to perhaps write a working paper or a blog or something based on the comments and on the Q&A and observations made here, which we can put up onto our website. And we're recording this today. We'll get it up on YouTube as soon as we possibly can and give it out as a resource to students and to teachers and others to use as they see fit, and to try to sort of further that kind of analysis, debate and discourse. But I want to, Juvaria and I would like both to thank you so much for your participation and contributions, and to our audience for sticking with us as well. And next week we have second in the series, and that's going to look at the regional effects of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the role of the United States in the world today. So slightly different question, but very, very interesting one as well. We have some very good scholars on those questions as well. So please join us again next week. But for this week, thank you so much to our speakers, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you very much for hosting us and for this very interesting conversation.
Total pleasure. Total pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.